Så hörni. Magnus Blixt, ny ordförande i skolhusgruppen. Förening med mer än 40 år på nacken. Vårt jobb är inte färdigt. Tvärtom. Vi pratade lite innan om det just. Att det är många saker i en lärmiljö och skolbyggnad som måste funka. Väldigt många olika. Och en av dem som kanske har pratats om men förbisetts lite är vikten av ljus. Rätt ljus. Och skolan ska ju vila på vetenskaplig grund, så att jag är väldigt glad att vi idag får en genomgång. Så vi kan stå på en stadigare grund. Vi som är här som lyssnar. Du får presentera dig själv och introduce yourself. Tack!
Hello everyone, my name is Stavroula Angelaki. I'm very glad that you're here and that I have the opportunity to present part of my research to you. I'm a PhD student here at KTH. I started in March 2021. And today I'm going to present to you the initial part of my research project, which is a literature review of existing research in school lighting for educational spaces. The paper that was shared with you is co-authored by Ute Pesniker and Christina Bodin-Danielsson. And as Christina said, they're both my supervisors throughout this PhD research project. So a little bit about today's agenda. I'm gonna have some introductory slides for the research project itself to explain a little bit what the project is about and why I did this literature review and what are the objectives. Then I'll go into the paper and what were the scopes, the methods and the outcomes and key points. And at the end of the presentation, I'll present a little bit about the extended review, because I'm in the process actually right now I have sent for publication an extended review where I have more papers, and I try to explore some questions that I wasn't able to answer after the first review. And in the end, I have some discussion points, and of course I can answer questions and we can discuss all together. So about the research project, it's called LISE, and the initials stand for Lighting in School Environments. It's the result of collaboration between KTH, Gävle University, and Sweco initially, but we have more collaborators, and I will shortly present them as well. KTH is the project leader of the project, and there are also other collaborators, and it's funded by the Energy Agency and Svensson's Foundation. So a little bit about the actors of this project. So we have the research, and I'm at KTH as Ute and Christina. We're in charge of lighting, architecture, and also noise. We have another collaborator. We also work with Gävle University, and here is where the specialists coming from education and pedagogy are in place, and with a clinical psychologist from Uppsala University, because of course we work with kids. So we need to have a specialist on how to approach them, what type of tools and methods we need to use, and how to talk to them. And then when it comes to practitioners, we worked with Sweco, with architects and lighting designers. But of course, since we also had to do some testings of fixtures, we had lighting manufacturers working with us. And we ended up collaborating with Anel and Nexia, where we also had the chance of customizing some of the light fixtures that we used in the school classrooms. And of course, our most important collaborators are Hudiksvall Kommun and Iggesund Skola, because we had the opportunity to actually work on site, to have workshops, discussions, and feedback sessions with teachers and pupils before the installation, to collect data on what we changed in the classroom, and also discuss what worked and didn't work of what we suggested. A little bit about the objectives of this project. From the initial literature that I read, and we also had discussions with Anneli and Jan from Gävle University, we all agreed that the physical environment is very important. They told me that they call it the third teacher here. So within the physical environment, we have environmental factors, and one of them is lighting, followed by noise and temperature. And this is what I'm working on, how lighting as an environmental factor can impact what is going on in the classroom, and whether it can also impact the activities, performance, and attention of pupils. So we start with the lighting in learning environment. We have Iggesund Skola, which is the testbed of this project, and we wanted to see how spatial perception, architecture, visual comfort can impact the educational activities. And for that, in order to be able to respond to some of these questions, we said that we should start with a literature review to find out what has been done, whether there are gaps in research, and where our project and this work can contribute. So I tried to compile some of the most common questions I had to answer while starting this project. And the first one is why lighting research is needed. So the starting point for this project is the phase out of fluorescent lighting after 2023 in Sweden, meaning that a lot of schools that currently have fluorescent lighting need to switch to LEDs. So we discussed that we need to avoid retrofitting solution. And by retrofitting, what I mean is that when you have a fluorescent tube, the most common practice is that you switch that, you take that down and you put an LED tube, and then technologically speaking, you're up to date. But the thing is that we miss out so many more things if we just retrofit classrooms, especially since the fluorescent lighting right now is phased out. We have the opportunity to do new lighting design, to talk with the teachers and see what is not working with the current lighting and switch not just to new tubes, but maybe a different configuration. So our target initially was proposals not related to retrofitting. And then with the literature review, my aim was to find an answer in what is missing from research right now, and whether there is a correlation between the lighting design that is suggested at the moment with the learning activities and the needs of teachers and pupils. So this is my transition into going with the review paper that was shared with you. This paper was initially presented at the Light Symposium in 2022 in Copenhagen. It corresponds to the initial stage of the research project, and its aim is to inform the definition of the research question and to actually guide us into a direction that is needed right now in research in schools. So as an overview for the paper, we collected research papers from 1980 until 2020 in order to inform ongoing research, explore advancements and differences in educational research, and define tendencies in school lighting across the years. And some of the topics that we found out that as variables are related to lighting were energy efficiency. And I have it first because it's the one I saw the most, to be honest. Performance, mood, and cognition when it comes to kids, and then perception and visual comfort. And the goal was to define what different methods were used in each decade, what were the tendencies and the equipment, and of course, which variables were mostly researched around across these decades. So a little bit about what we did with the papers. We worked with 4 different databases. We had the same search string in its database, and then we filtered out using additional keywords so that we ended up having papers only related to school, to educational spaces. We did not include kindergarten and university level papers because the research project itself is about primary education. Of course, there were limitations, as always, and I would say the most important one was that during the first 2 decades, so from 1980 until 2000, there were not a lot of papers corresponding to our research criteria. And the issue there was that even though the project that I'm working on is on a Nordic context, meaning that I collaborate with a school here in Sweden, I could not have a geographical limitation, meaning taking studies that were only performed in the Nordics because there were not enough papers. So we ended up having 47 papers, but they're from all over the world, basically. Of course, there were also changes in terminology from one decade to the other, meaning that when you use as a filter classroom, right now, in more recent papers, they don't use the terminology classroom per se, but it might be learning environment or innovative learning environment. And these also correspond to changes that do not correlate with architecture, but education and pedagogy. So I will go through some of the key points from its decade, and then I'll try to summarize everything so that we have some main discussion points from the first review paper. From the first decade, there were only 6 papers that corresponded to our search criteria. There were both studies about daylight and electric lighting. Of course, corresponding to this decade, we only have fluorescent lighting. In terms of methods, we have time-lapse photography, some measurements, light measurements and questionnaires. And what I can say in terms of methods is that all of them, they're very close to the users, meaning that they use methods that require the researchers to talk to the pupils and the teachers, which is not something that we see throughout the whole review. And as the main research areas, we have energy efficiency and sick leaves. I have to admit that during the first 2 decades, it seemed to be easier for researchers to acquire data related to health aspects in lighting, such as sickness leaves, growth, development, hormone levels, blood pressure, and so on. As we move after 2000, it's more and more difficult for someone in research to persuade, let's say, schools and teachers and parents to get this type of data. So moving on to the second decade after 1990 until 1999, the main light focus is daylight, which I have to admit that it makes sense because daylight is very much related to architecture, and throughout all decades, there is a consistency in terms of daylight being very good for higher performance when we talk about pupils. And studies related to electric lighting, they started comparing conventional fluorescent lamps with full spectrum ones. So we have some technological advancement, and there is a comparison between the old lighting and the new lighting. And in all cases that I had, at least in my review, the new lighting is better for performance, for mood, for behavior, and so on. In terms of methodologies, we have the same methods as in the first decade. And we have more and more tests related to performance, attention, and other cognitive functions in the classroom. As for research areas, there still energy efficiency is at the forefront. And as I mentioned, there are sick leaves, body growth, and other health-related aspects in connection to lighting. Moving on to the third decade, before presenting what I did before, I have to underline here that it's the first decade where we have the introduction of digital tools in classrooms, meaning that we have more cases where they use screens, laptops, or other tools that they are themselves light sources. So there is a transition here in from working on paper and on a very vertical surface to actually having a tool that emits light in addition to the already existing lighting in the classroom. Again, the lighting focus is very much on daylight. We have a few studies combining daylight and electric light and some others just focusing on electric light, and we're still very much on fluorescent lighting. In terms of methodologies, we have more and more simulation-based studies, which do not really, there is no dialogue in these studies between the researchers and the users, meaning teachers and pupils. It's just a more distant way of evaluating lighting. And all these studies that are simulation-based, they focus on energy efficiency and how they can minimize costs, because lighting is one of the main costs a school needs to face throughout the year. We still have light measurements and performance tests and questionnaires. And there is, during this decade, I found the first study that actually tried to link the different environmental factors, meaning lighting with noise and temperature. So it's not just about how lighting affects several factors in the classroom, but also how light in connection with other factors, they actually make better or worse, let's say, the performance of the pupils. And then the last decade, from 2010 to 2020, the number of papers in this decade is the highest. I had 24 papers corresponding to my search criteria. The lighting focus is, again, most of the 14 out of 24 there were about daylight. And these studies, they mostly focused on visual aspects like glare and preference in terms of where the pupils would like to sit in the classroom and work. And there is, again, a consistency that pupils prefer sitting locations closer to the windows, meaning that they have more daylight, they don't really want the electric lighting. In terms of methodology, there is a wider, there are methods from different disciplines, and also in the same study, they combine different methods, meaning you might have simulations at the beginning and then tests and questionnaires. So it's not just one methodology in order to assess the existing lighting, but several. As for research areas, again, there are a lot of energy related studies, and we have visual comfort, teaching activities, performance, and so on. And as I said before, there are not a lot of studies that have health-related aspects in relation to lighting. Although in this decade, we're already aware that blue light affects certain hormonal levels, but my assumption is that it's very difficult to be able to do that type of research within a school setting. I also tried to create a timeline to map out the user participation in research throughout the decades, and the active participation of the users is highest during the first and last decades. I would say that during the first one, it makes sense because there was less equipment compared to what we have available right now. And then in the middle of this literature review, we gradually have the implementation of different software and simulations. So the research focus shifted a lot towards computer-based evaluations of lighting, while after 2010, there is a combination of different methodologies. And there is also a shift towards more sociological/anthropological methods that should be used when we talk about spaces where the users have a different age group as well. So a little bit about the main key points from this literature review. There is an increase in the number of papers after 2010 in comparison to the previous 3 decades. And of course, there is an increased research interest. When we talk about school lighting, the available equipment is different. And we also have technological advancement, so there needs to be some testing before we start changing and retrofitting, in many cases, such spaces. Energy efficiency, as I said, is at the forefront of research because it's related to yearly cost reductions. And the available software makes the time component very different because time-wise, we can evaluate lighting way faster compared to having sensors everywhere and actually collecting data on a daily basis. Light measurement equipment changes, but we also have sensors that not only measure light, but also noise or temperature. So there is a combination of different environmental factors. And then there are a lot of different tests. And as we move forward, tests regarding what we're missing is that there was a common thread throughout these 4 decades regarding the placement of lighting. Every time lights are placed on the ceiling, although we all know that we have other available options in other spaces, but no one has actually tested lighting in different locations. And also the lights follow a grid-based pattern, meaning that we have the traditional classrooms, or we used to have the traditional classrooms where you have desks in rows and then lights are also placed in rows. However, right now, that's not the case in most schools. So even though the layout has changed and there are things when we talk about architecture and design that change, lighting remains the same. So it seems that there has not been done a lot of research related to how we should place the light sources. And then there's also a lack of studies correlating the light to the activity that takes place in the classroom. So having that as a starting point, I did an extended review because I hadn't read enough studies, and I kept the same, let's say, search criteria, but I included both kindergarten and university level studies. So I ended up analyzing and compiling 87 studies at this point. Before going into the presentation of this part of the extended review, I would like, as I mentioned before, to talk a little bit about different typology variations when it comes to architecture, because as I said, daylight was very much researched throughout this decade. And I made some sketches on how school buildings look. So we have the very common one that you have classrooms here in the green area along a single corridor, and this can be one school building. Usually these are one-story buildings. You can also have buildings facing an open area, which is where the kids usually spend their break time. You can have classrooms on both sides of the corridor, and that also affects where the windows are placed, meaning whether you're getting daylight from one side or from both sides. And then there are the L-shaped schools that both face the same area. And these, the last types of these schools, here we have a change because we no longer talk about 1 or 2 story buildings, but we start designing on a vertical axis, meaning that you have a different amount of daylight intake in the classrooms. So back to the extended review, I have a few of the results here. And the first layer of analysis was focusing on the light variable, so whether the studies focus on daylight or electric lighting. And as you can see, it's mostly studies on electric lighting after 2010, and that's linked to the availability of LED sources and also different control systems. So there is a lot of advancement on that domain. In daylight, I would say it's a little bit eliminated. There are combinations of daylight and electric light between 2000 to 2009, although daylight is gradually studied more and more. And then I wanted to find out whether there are retrofitting solutions, new design, or evaluations in these studies. So new design is consistently the least studied area among all the decades. So what usually happens is, as I mentioned at the beginning, they retrofit the existing lighting and they have a comparison between the fluorescent, the old lighting, and the LEDs. Evaluation studies are also the most common option in research, and evaluation studies, but what I mean by that is that they evaluate different control systems. And that usually corresponds to differences in brightness. So we don't change where the lights are placed. We might not change the technology. So you can have fluorescent lighting and fluorescent lighting that's dimmable, and you just evaluate this difference in control. And I also wanted to find out what happens within research in different educational stages, meaning what's the educational stage that has been researched the most. And the first one is primary education, followed by studies where they don't really mention if they study a certain age group or not, which I personally found very interesting. And then we have university, middle school, high school, and the last one is kindergarten. So the primary education and university level studies are mostly studied during the second and last decades. Kindergarten studies have increased after 2010, and also after 2010, there is the studies mentioned that there needs to be an ethics approval in order to collect any type of data from the school. What I found interesting is that there is an absence of correlation between the age group in question and the proposal, meaning that school lighting in general is somehow seen as a universal type of lighting for all age groups, and that's not the case, or at least it shouldn't be the case, because there are developmental changes. There are changes in vision when we compare kindergarten to primary school and then high school and so on. And there are, of course, changes on spatial perception and social needs. So all these changes are not taken into account when we talk about research. And we come to the discussion part of these two reviews. As I said, there is a consistency of daylight-related studies throughout all 4 decades. And all these studies show that there is a preference to daylight when we talk both about teachers and pupils. And the daylight helps have higher performance, higher attention. Generally speaking, when we talk about what's happening in the classroom, it's better having daylight to electric lighting. The light placement and distribution are not adequately researched in terms of lighting design. And there is also a lack of activity-based lighting, meaning that there is no correlation between the activity and the course and the needs when we talk about light. I believe that there needs to be more collaboration between practice and research. There needs to be more dialogue between research and the ones who use the spaces, teachers and pupils. And dialogue does not necessarily mean giving them a questionnaire or a test and then taking the results, but actual dialogue on what they need. From my experience and collaboration with the school, they're very well aware of what they want to have in the classroom. It's not, they might not use the same vocabulary as I do, as a lighting designer, but they know what they need. They know what's missing, they know what the problem is. So there is a gap there on how we do research and how often we ask the ones who are going to use the spaces. There is an increased number of studies with mixed methods approach, which I think it's very important. And another thing is that although I read a lot of different studies, it's very hard for me to say that there is something that I found as a design proposal that I would take as it is and replicate it in a different school. Because when we talk about light, we have orientation, we have geographic location and daylight intake, and these things vary so much around the globe. But also if we talk about Sweden, daylight varies if you're in the northern part, the central part, and the south part. So it's very difficult to say that there is a design that works in that school, and we're going to do the same thing here. So I would say that one needs to be very, very careful which aspects of different research studies is taking and replicating in new studies. And on the lower part of this slide, I have some of the most common lighting parameters. The ones that are consistently studied are CCT and intensity, the plus ones, and the rest are not even discussed in the studies that I found. I personally work with distribution and height on this project. I have to say that density is something that no one has ever talked about. Like, as lighting designers, we learn about it, we talk about it as a parameter. Density, how close lights are to each other. So it has to do with where you place the light, and if one light source is very close to the other, and how that influences the light in the space. And I know that I mentioned before activity-based lighting, and the reason I did that is because I'm going to use as an example what I learned from the school we worked with. At Igesund Scholar, they used cooperative learning, which includes a lot of group work, discussion, and they might work in groups of 2, 3, 4, or more. And that means that there is a lot of change in the space. They might need a smaller working space, like 1 desk or 2 or 3 desks combined. And that does not really correspond to this very uniform type of lighting they have right now. So that's why I keep mentioning again and again that we need to find out what are the needs of the space and what activities take place before we start talking about lighting. So the layout of the classrooms at Igesund reflect the teaching techniques and the way pupils work with each other. But at the same time, they have so many different tools they work with throughout the day. So we don't just talk about light levels on a vertical surface on the desk, because we need to take into account that they use laptops. They also have screens on the walls. They might have smart boards. When someone is working with a smart board, that instantly means that there is movement in space. So it's not just a static situation and a static type of lighting that we should suggest for them. I have to say that only 5 studies after 2010, they focus on activity-based lighting out of 87 in total that I had for the second review. So it's a very small sample of studies that take into account teachers and pupils in that perspective. And my remarks is that generic solutions do not necessarily work. They don't really correspond to how classrooms are being used right now. There is a need for dialogue with the users, and not just once, I would say dialogue across different stages of the project, and the mapping of current equipment and current activities in order to be able to better correspond to what we're suggesting. And that's why I keep saying every time I present my project that, for instance, what I suggested for that school, I would never say that can be suggested for every school around the country or the area. It might be a good approach how one works to result in a certain solution, but the solution itself does not mean that can work and have positive results in every situation. So in general, all of these parameters need to inform the lighting design and also guide how we talk about light in space. And to result, I try to answer these two questions I had at the very beginning. So in terms from what is missing from the existing research, there is a missing correlation between spatial elements and the lighting layout. There needs to be more flexibility because there is a flexibility on how they switch from one activity to the other throughout the day. And research related to light distribution, light placement, density, other light parameters other than cecity and intensity. And of course, there are various needs based on the teaching and learning activities. So there needs to be a connection between the lighting and the activities in the classroom. And differences maybe in light intensity based on the activities. It could be light distribution, meaning where do you need light? We might not want to have light on the desks at all times. If we're using screens or if we're projecting on the wall, we don't need light on the desk because our focus is on another surface in the classroom. And a correlation between daylight availability and electric light, which I think is a very important parameter and aspect, because the more we use digital tools in classrooms, the more we need contrast. And sometimes in order to be able to use digital tools, we block daylight. And it's not necessarily a good practice. So with that, I would like to end this presentation and thank you very much for your attention.
I have questions. You said you cannot design one solution for a school, for a system, but would you like for like you need to have a school, each school need to have a individual design of light, but can you make a solution per activity? Would you describe like a single solution for a single activity?
Yes, but then I would say yes, but then the activity needs to correspond to a certain age group. So I wouldn't say that I would suggest a lighting for maths, but then you have this same lighting for maths in the 1st grade, 6th grade, 9th grade, and so on. So apart from the activity, it's also the age group that needs to be taken into account.
But if you would like to make a dream scenario,
yes,
of a lighting of a school, let's say primary school, so how would you describe it? If you move to the school, to the entrance, I think we just make a walk through the school. How would you describe which kind of lighting you would expect in a perfect world to be? Like you go to the entrance.
I don't have as part of the project, I don't work with light outside of the classroom. So I'm looking at what is happening with the lighting just in the classroom. Ideally, if I had a lot of more time, I would like to do the rest, like the corridor. But for the classroom itself, I would say it would be very nice during the beginning of the day to have something very deep, maybe, and then you gradually have higher intensity just to showcase that we start with like course 1, let's say, and then having variations when it's about to be break time, or if you're working, if they have to do individual work and they have to write down something on a piece of paper, then you have light on the desks. If the teacher wants to present something on screen like that, you don't need the light on the desk. So you say which shift or focus we need to look at there. So there can be, in terms of controls, you can have a panel with buttons and then having different buttons with different lighting scenarios and then switching between those. Yes.
I have a question. I think when I studied architecture in the 1970s, we discussed indirect light, where you don't see the bulb or the LED. you just can have some shining on the ceiling without seeing the lamp, and that is very much not disturbing. Very perfect in corridors, and I think also to have this not very light when you want it to take down.
I'm a very big fan.
Yes, you did not mention any types of lighting. You said that this fluorescent and electric lights, but how does this indirect light come into
my project or
to the study? I mean, did you find anything about that kind of lighting?
They don't really mention it. I know that in some studies they have indirect lighting because of the photos of the illustrations they have in the papers, but they don't really mention it as a variable. So they don't look whether it's indirect and direct. And in most cases, it's direct lighting. It's either tubes or the LED panels.
I mean, it's also daylight is also indirect. We can see how the light is sloping on this wall here, and I mean, for architects, that's a very important question about architecture.
No, it's not really mentioned, and it's also not mentioned in terms of what type of materials and colors one has in space. Because of course, if we compare to different classrooms and there is a different color on the wall, the indirect lighting is different. Even if they're one next to the other and they have the same daylight, but it's not.
You could not find any.
No.
Then you have to read older texts about architecture, because they were very occupied about that. Teachers I had.
Maybe it's because I was only looking at research studies, research articles, published research articles, because I did find 2 articles on a newspaper from the 1990s. And there were teachers, one of them was a kindergarten teacher, and she was explaining how she started changing the textiles in the classroom to play around with the light. But it was not published in a journal. So the review I did was targeting specifically research studies.
Yeah.
You also mentioned that when you talk with the teachers, then they know what they want.
Yes.
And they don't have what they want.
Yes.
But you mean why it happens like this? I mean, how it's changed.
I don't think it's only one answer to this question. I can tell you that my understanding is when someone, for instance, is using a software to evaluate energy efficiency, they don't talk to the teachers. So, for instance, if within the software they test different lighting fixtures and one of them is resulting in cost reductions, they retrofit the whole classroom to that fixture. They never have a dialogue with whether the teachers are more or less pleased with what happens. When they use sensors to again make light measurements, there is the same pattern. There is no dialogue. There is no discussion with the ones using the space necessarily. There are studies where they have questionnaires and interviews, and there sometimes the suggestions and the proposals when it comes to light, they're different. But generally speaking, it's not a very common practice.
Okay.
I have two comments. First, do we want coffee now, or because we have arranged for coffee and sweets? Do we want to forget that? It's nice. But you can have it and then continue. Otherwise,
So if I just have my question, unfortunately, we go in a few minutes. Is that okay for you?
yes, then you won't have
3 minutes.
your sweet, you know.
I might take you with me. Anyway, as Magnus said in the introduction, we are supposed to take decisions based on practice and evidence from research books. And I think most of us or most of you that work within projects, learning environment projects, when it comes to lighting as well, understand that we are not using the full potential in what lighting can offer today. So my question is, how come the research hasn't sort of put enough focus on this in order for us to know this? Is it the fault of you, or is it the fault of the developers of lighting system? I mean, there are so many things we can do, and we know a lot about how that affects us and the students, people. So, but still, nothing is happening. In brand new schools, I would say in Sweden, not even 1% of them are using, it's standard everything. So how come? Why is research doing so poorly on this?
Yes.
Yeah.
What I have
Sorry,
to,
I don't mean to be.
No.
It's just
No.
it's an observation.
What I have to say when it comes to research is that we cannot change a lot of things at the same time, because research-wise, even though we might get positive results, we don't know what change caused the positive results. So that's why you see studies where they have the same lighting, and then one light is cold white and the other one is warm white, and it's just that what changes. You have no change in intensity, you don't place it elsewhere. So within research, I have to say that each study needs to look at one, maximum 2 variables. So we cannot change everything at once. Now, when it comes to technology and available fixtures, we used fixtures that are they cost a lot. And when we had discussions with the municipality and the school, the feedback we got is that they're very, from the municipality basically, they look very nice, they're very good. We cannot afford to change all the lighting.
Of course.
So, and I'm not pointing fingers.
No.
I mean, I think that's the reality in many cases. So that's why in a lot of schools, they end up using very standard solutions because they're more affordable than others.
Mhm.
In our case, the project paid for the fixtures and they're going to stay there. We're not taking them back. So it's like
I agree that it's more expensive, but the gap is getting more and more narrow. So it's not extremely more expensive to get better things. I think you need to get the understanding of how much better the students will perform, and all those things, and also energy efficiency, of course, as well. So I'm not
But
not
also,
an expert, but
I think it's also a process how you design. Because when you design a school, you design a building. And when you design the building, you design the ceiling. When you design the ceiling, in a very first stages, you design where the light should be. And you know nothing. And you don't get the contract for the interior design as an architect. And if we focus on, if we say that certain lighting is best for this activity, then as an architect, this activity will be in this room, then you can in early stages design for this activity. That's what I think. But the thing is that you move the furniture.
the planning process that is not.
There's no holistic view. Actually, it's very fragmented for economic reasons. Actually, Sweden is more than any other country, actually.
I have two comments. One of them is related to you, and the other one, or both of them are a little correlated. But I think, like in an area which is quite conservative, where there's a lot of work to be done, one of the easiest way in complexity to achieve validity is to go for the low hanging fruits. And that's why maybe we're not very high up in the complexity level. And one of the reasons for maybe being very conservative in a very complex area is because even the how questions, how do we do good lighting, even if that is by no means simple, it's also very complex. I think the more pressing issue is not the how questions. The more pressing issues is the why questions. Like, why is lighting important? People, first we need to understand that before we can start discussing the implication. I think that has to do. I don't think people understand why it is important.
No.
How we have some knowledge of, like not a lot, but there's a lot of things that most people can agree upon, and if we would just apply what most people can agree upon, we have a lot to make a really big change. But there's also the beauty in it that there's so much that we still don't know, which I really like.
But there's like a need, it's like you talked about the performance studies, but it's like it's not getting out there.
Yeah.
I think it's like giant, and we know that as researchers, me being both designer and researcher, it's like different arenas where this knowledge is spread, and it doesn't make the headlines. And it should make headlines if we do find correlation and significance. Sometimes you don't, because there are so many multiple factors, it's so hard to measure. And that's why in research you try to measure one thing, only to be able to say this has an impact. But in reality, there's never only one thing. There are so many factors. So in the end, it's very hard. But can we have
Before we do that, I add just one more comment to this, especially as you have to go, because I think what Stavroula presented here is really the wonderful overview of where the gaps are.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And we didn't even, get yet to the study then itself, which there will be future presentation, which is actually really excited about, which I'm really excited about, that you feel that this is really needed, that there needs to be a communication. Why is lighting important in schools, and how can we shift this, right? And then how is it possible to implement lighting design earlier into the architectural design process, and also convince some of the municipalities that it's necessary to provide a little bit more budget for this, because there is knowledge out there that lighting is actually incredibly relevant, especially in the Nordics, especially if, we all know here what the winters are like, and that this is not yet known more and better and implemented is just, I don't know, there is a why there for me.
Sure.
Lighting is regarded as exclusion of darkness, which I think most of us in this room don't agree upon. But that's how the common man, the common woman views it. That's an issue.
And there is a big, light and light wellness, light dark wellness, health, performance, biophilia discussion within, the expert community. And so how that can trickle down more is a really, good thing to.
My assumption is that if there were more studies relating health, lighting, and kids, and showing how, for instance, development might be affected, or hormone levels, sleep patterns, and so on, because these are things we already know. But if there was a study linking these things in schools, it would make the headlines. Like if someone had access to this, but I think it's so difficult to be able to gather a research group and get permission, basically.
Right? I mean, the
Miljöpsykologi.
psychology with
Some of the papers.
Torbjörn and Rick. Torbjörn and what the other guy.
Nico.
Nico.
Yeah.
For example, there is in Sweden that kind of research.
It's more needed, I would say.
Yeah,
because it's something that's I'm not trying to say that having higher performance is not enough. But when you talk about health, everyone listens, because then you say, okay, lighting affects some health-related factors. You need to pay attention, and I think most people do.
You've done that with noise, for example. Noise has had a tremendous impact with research on noise the last decades. No one can ignore it. It's not only because we nowadays more often maybe work in open plan offices, which are 30% decrease of performance, which is known, but not spoken about by the real estate, because they're pushing for open plan, because it's from their perspective very good, because it's more flexible as being a real estate owner when you have to adjust the office for new tenants. But it's like you have to be a very knowledge client to say, no, I don't want that. It's bullshit. I want this. This is good for my school. But then it has to come out like hell, or I even think performance is really, because that's actually what school is about. It's about learning. That's why the kids are there.
And also pupils with within the autism spectrum or with ADHD, they are affected by light. They're more sensitive to light changes, to flicker, to these light parameters in comparison to the rest of the pupils. But again, it's very difficult having the information which of the participants are diagnosed and which are not. So it's I would say the process is very tricky. If you want to include officially data relating lighting to this type of data.
But it's just like the modern society dilemma. We are not able to do the research society needs because ethical reasons have now cut the wings of the researchers, to be honest. I mean, that's why the ethical authority is so criticized. Nowadays, some of the breakthrough studies cannot be done because something happened. There was a scandal at Karolinska Institute, which we know was not because of the researchers, was because the headmaster, they approved, they knew, they were warned, and then they changed the ethical process instead of handling the real problem. It's like, to me, to be honest, I think that's a typical sign of the modern society today. And it's very frustrating, like in school projects, that it's very hard to do any of these studies, and the parents are also very maybe afraid because they don't know what they're signing when we say, are you willing to participate, because we make such a big fuss of it, when actually we're never going to, ethicals in research, it's completely forbidden to spread the name. Everyone is anonymous. It's been so for ages, decades. So that has never happened. I mean, you're not, and it's like you understand where I'm coming from.
I wonder what the correlation is between like being action prone and the availability of correlation. And the availability of correlation can be like a legal thing with like you're discussing, where the anonymity and stuff. It can also be like, for example, with lighting, it's such a complex area, and we all know that there is a very general, very specific consensus that good lighting creates good stuff, but because it's very difficult to measure in a very precise way, I think there might be a correlation between action prone and like complexity to correlate, or availability to correlate. It's a theory. But
I also have an aspect on the classroom. I'm an interior architecture, and when you work with the furniture in the classrooms, all the teachers want to furnish the classroom in different ways. So you put in a group of furniture that they have a place when you do the project, but then after 2 weeks they have changed the furniture's place in the classroom, and that's also a dimension of the lighting, because if in the start in the project maybe you have one big mat in the front of a classroom, but after 2 months it's in the back of the classroom, and so it's even harder to find a place the furniture or the lighting in the roof. If you don't should move
to move the light with it.
Yeah, you have to move the lights.
It's a bit like what my answer was his question, that it's changing so much in the process. So it's safe to make a general lighting.
Yeah, it's the easy way.
It's a bit like but it's if I was thinking that your sentence that you wrote, that activity based lighting. If you decide that's this type of lighting should be for this activity and can be moved with the furniture kind of with the activity. I was thinking about how can you make this light like clear, but for this activity, this lighting. For this activity. We did, okay. But you want to okay. Just not showing now.
No, we did. And as I mentioned, we have different buttons and then they switch between the buttons and discuss the scenarios with the pictures. So
It will be continued.
we try to.
Did they understand it?
Not all of them, and they don't use equally all of the scenarios. So we discussed them before me going there with people to change the lighting. Then we had a discussion during the data collection. And we're going to have another feedback session now that the experiment is ended, because we have the opportunity to change some of the settings. So they're going to give us feedback on what works and what does not work and some suggestions so we can readjust the scenarios. But they did because I designed a scenario for they watch a lot of movies when they have the social sciences courses and sometimes during English. So they use the screens. And I created a scenario with very, very dim lighting where the focus is on the screens, and they told me that it's very easy for them to shift if they want to watch a video, or maybe if they want to show something on the screens before ending the day. It's very easy for them just to press the button, change the lighting, and then everyone is focused.
And so the questions that came up with direct lighting, so that was implemented in so in the study there were components of direct lighting, there were components of indirect lighting, and then depending on activities, there was a different type of light.